I am going to start talking. My name is John Kunkel. I'm the Senior Economics Advisor for the United States Studies Centre. Following on that first session, which was fantastic, I tend to introduce myself every time by saying, hello, my name is John. I'm a recovering free trade economist working on industrial policy and economic security. But look, thank you very much. And we're now moving to the third session. This session will bring US-China strategic competition more squarely into the foreground, notwithstanding that we've already given it a good run around the park already. Let me quote from Australia's recently released National Defence Strategy. Entrenched and increasing strategic competition between the United States and China is a primary feature of our, i.e. Australia's, strategic environment. This obviously has a critical economic dimension as well. Now, it's not the only prism for our conference, and we continue to stress that, but it's a critical one, as we know. And we're delighted to have join us to frame this discussion today, Dr. Elizabeth Economy. There really is no one better placed to outline the broad Chinese geostrategic and economic challenge and the corresponding US response than Elizabeth Economy. She's the Harvard Grove Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. From 2021 to 2023, Dr. Economy served as Senior Advisor on China to the US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. She was previously at the Council on Foreign Relations for more than a decade. She is the author of numerous books, too many to mention, but I'll mention the most recent one, The World According to China. After Dr. Economy's keynote address, I'll invite Richard McGregor from the Lowy Institute for a conversation moderated by me to pick up some of the key themes. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks also to Mike and my former wonderful research associate, Jared Monshine, who's now here at the USCC. That was like 14 years ago, right, Jared, that you worked with me at the Council on Foreign Relations. So it's really great to be here. And as John said, I'm going to take a step back and talk about China's broader geostrategic and economic ambitions and sort of the implications for US policy. So let me start by taking you back to 2001, when China was on the cusp of WTO accession. And then Senator Joe Biden, who was traveling in China at the time, said, "The United States welcomes China's emergence as a great power because great powers adhere to international norms." A little bit less than 2 decades later, however, President Joe Biden offered a very different assessment. He said, "We have to push back against the Chinese government's abuses and coercion that undercut the foundations of the international economic system. Everyone must play by the rules." I think President Biden's 2 statements really bookend both the promise and the ultimate failure of US hopes concerning the path that China would follow. The US policymakers, and here I would say overwhelmingly both Democrats and Republicans, believed that if the United States encouraged China's integration into the international system of regimes and organizations, that this process, coupled with growth in China's economy and its middle-class expansion, would contribute to accelerate its economic and political liberalization at home and make China, in the words of Deputy Secretary Bob Zoellick, a responsible stakeholder in the international system. Instead, I think most Americans would say that China has moved in a radically different direction, one that has made the US-China relationship more complex and more challenging than at any time, I would argue, since the normalization of relations in 1979. Of course, it takes 2 to tango, and the United States does bear some responsibility for the deterioration in the relationship. But I am fond of quoting Wang Jise, who is one of China's most renowned scholars of the US-China relationship, who says, if you want to understand why US policy has changed, it's because China has changed. And I think there are really 2 important inflection points in terms of Chinese policy change. The first was in 2008, when China hosted the Olympics, and the United States hosted the global financial crisis. And I think at that moment, it really represented China's emergence on the global stage as a great power. No longer an emerging power, but really had become a great power. And at the same time, It looked at the United States, and I think the allure of the US as an economic model was diminished. And you began to have the Chinese talk about moving the world away from the dollar as the world's reserve currency, began to have more assertive military action in the South China Sea. And generally, there was a lot more chatter in Chinese think tanks and among Chinese officials that, we always knew that the Chinese economy would surpass that of the United States, but it's just going to happen a lot faster than we had assumed. The second inflection point, I think, was in 2012, and arguably a more important one, and that really was the advent of Xi Jinping as General Secretary of the Communist Party, and then 2013 as President of the country. And he brought with him this notion of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. All post-1949 Chinese leaders have had their own notion of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation or the great revival of the Chinese nation. But Xi Jinping brought with him, I think, not only a vision, but intentions and capabilities. He defined it as reclaiming centrality on the global stage. What that meant exactly, we didn't know, but I think after 12 years in power, I think he's transformed China both at home and abroad. At home, China's become a much more repressive and authoritarian country, and abroad it's become much more ambitious and expansive. In practical terms, I think the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is played out across 5 dimensions, and there's all ways in which I think they pose significant challenges to the United States and to other market democracies. So I'm just going to tick through these and then talk a little bit about the US policy response. The first, I think, sort of part of Xi Jinping's broader strategy is to redraw the very map of China, to incorporate what China believes are its sovereign territory. So that in the first instance, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the South China Sea, but I think as everybody in this room recognizes, China also has contested territory with Japan, Korea, India, Bhutan, Nepal, and Russia. And in a number of cases we've seen China is pursuing military action in ways that are highly destabilizing in the region. The second sort of part of China's overall ambition is to push the United States out as the dominant power, military power in the Asia-Pacific. Xi Jinping is fond of saying that Asia is for Asians to govern. Clearly, he doesn't mean Japan or Korea or India. He means China. He's putting in place, or trying to put in place, a regional security and economic architecture that excludes the United States. And he constantly talks, as do many Chinese officials, about the need to dissolve the US-led alliance system. He describes the US-led alliance system as anachronistic, a relic of the Cold War, and targeted against China. I think this is a heavy lift for China, pushing the US out, because so many countries do want the United States there to balance against a more assertive China. But I also think that China is investing very heavily in its military capabilities, and it has, as we heard earlier, the advantage of proximity. It has geographic advantage. The third objective is to ensure that other countries align their values, priorities, and policies with those of China. I think China's greatest asset is its economy when it comes to influencing other countries and the strength of its market, and it uses it both as a carrot and, as we heard earlier, as a stick in terms of economic coercion. The Belt and Road Initiative is really China's flagship foreign economic policy initiative. It began in 2013 as hard infrastructure connecting a number of China's poorer interior regions to external markets, also as a vehicle for the export of Chinese overcapacity, particularly in the construction sector, and also as a genuine desire, I think, to help fill the massive global need for infrastructure. But it's expanded, of course, since then. We have the digital Silk Road, fiber optic cables, e-commerce, satellite systems, cloud computing, 5G. We have the health Silk Road that came to life during COVID, the export of Chinese traditional medicine, as well as Chinese e-health technology. We have the Green Silk Road, which is environmental technologies. We can now see overcapacity in that sector. So a number of offshoots of this Belt and Road. There's a political component. Somebody mentioned Tanzania earlier. China has set up a training center for countries from East Africa where they can go and learn about the China model. How do you have a strong one-party system? How do you do poverty alleviation? How do you control the internet and civil society? Roughly 36 countries have taken cybersecurity training from China, again, on how to control the internet, how to manage dissent. So there's an element of China exporting parts of its political model globally through the Belt and Road Initiative. And finally, we've seen a military element to this. China established its first military logistics base in Djibouti. It has talked about plans for further military facilities in countries like the UAE, Equatorial Guinea, the Seychelles, I think all told about 7 or 8 other countries. It conducts joint exercises with an increasing number of countries. And I think one thing to watch is the sort of soft alliance that we were talking about a little bit earlier with North Korea and Russia, China, and Iran. And whether or not, as we look ahead, right, in support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, whether or not as we look ahead, we should expect some of these countries and maybe more to become engaged economically or even militarily if China were to take action against Taiwan. We already talked about the coercive use of China's sort of economic market and strength, and Australia has obviously experienced that firsthand. I would just say that I think under Xi Jinping, the use of this economic coercion has expanded, and the reasons behind it have also expanded to the point in 2019 that the Chinese government, CCTV, came out and said that any issue related to sovereignty or political stability did not fall within the purview of free speech. Right? This was in the wake of the case of Daryl Morey and the Houston Rockets, where he tweeted, "Fight for freedom and stand with Hong Kong." But the idea that China believes that it should be able to control speech, outside its geographic domain on an enormous range of issues, or if not, you can expect some kind of economic penalty. The fourth area of competition is in the area of global governance, international institutions and regimes, and Xi Jinping gave a speech back in 2014 where he said that China should lead in the reform of the global governance system. It should help not only to write the rules of the game, but create the playgrounds on which those games are played. I think China's efforts have been targeted primarily at areas around development, human rights, internet sovereignty, and technical standards, and it plays brilliantly within the United Nations and international organizations. There are many articles and even books that have been written on this topic, and it's something that I think the United States, has only recently woken up to. But in China, and Xi Jinping has made clear that he also wants to play a larger role in setting rules in the maritime domain, in the Arctic, and space. These are places where he thinks there's room for China to play a leadership role. Over the past 3 years, China has put forward a number of global initiatives: the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. All of them, if you read through them, they can just sound, sort of esoteric, just maybe rhetoric, not that meaningful, but actually they boil down to some pretty significant things. They boil down to the end of the US-led alliance system, as well as China's support for the notion of indivisible security, which is what Russia uses to justify its invasion of Ukraine, namely that when a country's security feels threatened, it can, in fact, act in a preemptive way. It boils down to the elevation of development over political and civil rights, and the notion that countries and states should be able to determine the rights within their own geographic boundaries. There is no such thing, really, as universal human rights that need to be respected. And I would say in a new effort, I think China's taken advantage of the US sanctions of Russia to push globally the notion of de-dollarization. And we see, I think, pretty significant pickup through the BRICS and to a lesser extent the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that China is pushing this as well, and an increasing amount of trade is being settled, not only in renminbi, but also in other countries' currencies. And I think there's a lot of interest in this. Finally, I think Xi Jinping has sought to transform the relationship of the Chinese economy to that of the global economy. We've seen a massive push on the securitization of the Chinese economy. We talked about military-civil fusion, or it was mentioned earlier. a number of laws that have been passed domestically in China around anti-espionage law, on data security. There's the ramping up of indigenization of technology. This has been part of China's economy and its plans, for decades. This is nothing new, but certainly Made in China 2025 was quite ambitious. The amount that China is investing in the semiconductor space, we were talking earlier about US industrial policy, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what China has been doing. And I think that holds true for a number of sort of critical and emerging technologies. And then there's, as Jonathan mentioned, the continuation of China's old policies, IP theft and cyber economic espionage and, overcapacity. All of these, I think, come together in Xi Jinping's notion of dual circulation, which he articulated in 2020, basically the idea that China can innovate, manufacture, and consume largely within itself because its economy is so large. It wants to continue to be able to export, of course, to the rest of the world. It wants to be able to import just that sort of technical know-how or the technologies that it needs. And it wants multinationals to remain dependent on China for parts of their supply chains, and Xi Jinping has been explicit about this, because that then gives them leverage, gives the Chinese leverage over other governments. This does not seem like a good bet for the rest of the world. I think the result of sort of all of these changes that we've seen in Chinese policy for the US-China relationship has been to make the relationship certainly more explicitly competitive. The range of issues that we now sort of face tensions and conflict over has expanded dramatically. If you look for the first 30 odd years of the relationship, the bilateral relationship, you were basically focused on trade, Taiwan, and human rights. But as I hope I've laid out, the number of issues on which the US and China are butting heads is an enormous array of issues at this point. It's a much more zero-sum framing of the relationship. China talks often about how socialism will triumph over capitalism, or the rise of the East over the West. Certainly the United States has adopted a very competitive framing as well, and frankly I would say the media bear an enormous responsibility for casting virtually every issue, from clean technology to math scores, in a frame of a US-China competition. I would argue the competition is actually not between the United States and China, but instead a competition among values and norms more broadly. And then the third, I think, implication is really, or the result of this change in China's policy is this notion that engagement failed. And I think that came right at the time of the Trump administration, but although articulated, I think, most notably by two members of the Obama and now Biden administration, Kurt Campbell and Eli Ratner. But really what that signaled in some respects was, first of all, a loss of support within the United States by the two groups that were most proactive in their support of a robust and positive US-China relationship, namely the US business community and US civil society. So changes that China made on the ground, both in terms of regulations that made it more difficult for US business to compete, but also that made it far more difficult for US NGOs, for example, non-governmental organizations, to engage in China, meant that these two communities became much less supportive of that robust policy. So when the relationship was in difficulty, you had less of a push to somehow move the relationship to the fore. And then I think, as Jonathan mentioned, the US lost patience. It was one thing when China was an emerging economy and the United States, yes, would take some actions to counter particularly egregious, Chinese behaviors in the World Trade Organization. But by and large, the argument that you would hear over and over again, for example, on something like IP theft, was China is an emerging economy. When it has IP to protect, it will do a better job. We need to model best behavior. It's on the right trajectory. It's on the right track. And all of that argumentation is basically gone. So let me just finish up now and talk a little bit about US policy. So broadly, US policy is termed managed competition. That's the name the Biden administration has come up with. It recognizes China as the most important long-term strategic competitor explicitly. And it says we need to manage that competition. We don't want it to devolve into kinetic conflict. I would say from the time that I arrived at the Commerce Department in September of 2021 through the spring of 2023, the vast majority of the work that was done in the US government was on the competitive side and not the cooperative side. It was really about putting in place the building blocks that the United States felt it needed to be able to compete effectively with China for the 21st century. And I think even if you look back to the meeting between Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken with their counterparts Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi, you'll maybe remember that Secretary of State Blinken said, we want to negotiate from a position of strength. And so you have the policy, which is invest, align, and compete. Invest, and here maybe, Jonathan, I would say it's not simply the CHIPS and Science and IRA and bipartisan infrastructure law aren't necessarily defense as much as they are also offense. I think it was taking a step back and recognizing that the United States had really fallen behind in terms of having the basic innovation and manufacturing capabilities that it needed to be able to compete globally, not even just with China, but compete globally in some core sectors like semiconductors and clean technology. And bipartisan infrastructure law includes, basically providing broadband for everybody in the United States. So it's about running faster. The compete part, and we've talked a lot about the economic tools, so I won't say that anymore about that, but it really is about modernizing our economic tools to ensure that we are protecting our economic and national security, maintaining our economic competitiveness, and I would say also trying to continue to advance US global economic leadership. And then align, so a number of new institutions, the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, the G7 work that goes on, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the Quad Critical and Emerging Technologies Working Group, AUKUS. What's interesting, I think, to note about all of these is that if you look across them, you'll find that many of them focus on the same set of issues. And so whether it's artificial intelligence or it's the green transition or supply chains, critical minerals, digital skilling, you'll find that a lot of these issues are discussed in IPEF and in the US-EU TTC and in the Quad. So there's a lot of overlapping work. There may be some need to rationalize it and to bring it all together in some different framing. But I think it's just useful to understand that what's happening in terms of the US partnerships with Asian allies and partners is also happening with Europeans and really does reflect, I think, a US understanding that it cannot go it alone. And then finally, I'll say just 2 words about cooperation with China. So I went with Secretary Raimondo to China last August. We were the 4th department to go. So this is when basically the doors to cooperation opened up within the US government. I would say that there was some knocking on the door by a number of agencies to try to say, hey, we kind of want to establish some, get back in the game of actually talking to the Chinese about the commercial relationship. And I think all the agencies had some interest in reestablishing contact and channels of communication. So Secretary of State Blinken went, Secretary Yellen, Secretary Kerry for climate, and then Secretary Raimondo from the Commerce Department. Overall, the meetings were quite constructive in the sense that the Chinese were really very businesslike. There was no discussion of Xi Jinping thought, not even one mention. There was no mention of Taiwan. And for those of you that negotiate and do a lot of work with China, you'll recognize that this is actually fairly unusual. The Chinese spent a lot of time from the premier on down talking about how they were meeting with US business and CEOs, US businesses and CEOs, and hearing their complaints and taking these things seriously as the sign that things were changing in China. And Secretary, of course, said, yeah, it's one thing to listen, but you're not going to get US business to go back unless we actually see changes on the ground. And I would say we still haven't seen many of those changes on the ground. I would also say I think it's very hard for China and for the econ ministries to do the kinds of things that some of them would like to do. I think Xi Jinping has empowered them, but empowered them only up to a point. He has equally empowered the security apparatus, so that while we were there, the day that we left, in fact, China, an ad came out. It was a meme that came out with the secretary posing with the Huawei Mate phone as though she was advertising it. And then the Ministry of State Security or Public Security, I can't remember which one it was now, came out and said, that the visit was just old wine in a new bottle. But right after that, we got a call from the Ministry of Commerce saying that they hoped that these these things didn't, undermine the sort of positive nature of the visits and the meetings that the Secretariat had. So I think a clear indication of a split within the Chinese government, and frankly speaking, I think a lack of strength on the part of the econ ministries. We established 4 different working groups, and Treasury had 4 working groups, and everybody had a bunch of working groups. I would say, and some of these working groups now, the Commerce Department have met once and twice. I would say that intentions are good, but actual results and cooperation is very thin. So there's a kind of a thin veneer of cooperation, mostly focused on, again, just maintaining channels of communication, and ensuring that this relationship doesn't deteriorate further. But I think very little opportunity for true substantive cooperation to emerge. And I would just flag on the climate front, which is one of the areas, Secretary Kerry was extremely committed to making progress with his longtime collaborator, Xie Zhenhua, on the climate issue. I think John Podesta brings a different vision to the table, and we've heard him talking about, carbon leakage, and I think it was carbon dumping, but basically the idea that he wants to establish a new trade framework to take into account the fact that China's manufacturing across an array of products is roughly 3 times less efficient than that in the United States and other advanced economies. So a different mindset and possibly less cooperative on that front. So I'll stop there. I have some thoughts about next steps, but maybe we can talk about them in the Q&A. And just say, I think we're in for a continued bumpy road in the U.S.-China relationship, whether it is a Biden or a Trump administration. But I think it's important that we continue to engage in China, and maybe just as a positive reminder that, if you peel back the onion a little bit, you'll see there are as many different perspectives in China as there are in the United States or, any country represented here, and we always want to keep the door open to those people. Thanks.
Thanks, Liz. That was fantastic. I'm now being joined also by Richard McGregor from the Lowy Institute, who's a senior fellow for East Asia. Richard's a former Beijing and Washington bureau chief for the FT and the author of numerous books on East Asia. I'm a big fan of Richard's. I'm a particular fan of his book, Asia's Reckoning, because to my knowledge, that's the only place where my very small print-run PhD gets referenced anywhere in the Western world. So.
It's always a great honour to be a footnote.
Oh. Thanks, Liz. I'll throw to Richard first. You travel around this region extensively. You talk to a lot of senior decision makers. Why don't you give us a bird's eye view of how US-China strategic competition is being viewed in different parts of the region as we sit here this morning, not least the economic dimension that we're talking a lot about.
Yeah, well, I'll focus on Southeast Asia, and I've done a lot of travelling there last year talking about China with those countries and officials and think tanks and the like. And I guess if you boil down the question, is the post-American world in Southeast Asia a Sino-centric one? Now, China would have you believe it is, and I think they've worked very hard and quite successfully at have this narrative power about that. So let me put it like this, if you think, as we do in Australia, that the greater instability in the region is because of China's assertiveness, then you'll think China is the problem. If you think that the greater instability in the region is because of US-China competition, then I think America becomes the problem. And I think China has been very effective at creating that kind of narrative. Second thing, as Liz says, China doesn't focus on democracy. Everywhere around the world in the UN, they want to replace the word democracy with development. That works very well in Southeast Asia. So do I believe that it's kind of game over? China wants to create this impression resistance is futile, get with the program type thing. I think once you pull up the hood, the region looks much more contested. Now, BRI lending is going down dramatically for all the sorts of reasons we know. China's running out of money. They're a creditor country around the world rather than just giving the money out. It's a vector for corruption, et cetera, et cetera. That's one thing. And if you look at the countries where China is dominant in lending. It's 3 of them: Indonesia, Laos, Cambodia. Everywhere else is much more contested. Japan, South Korea, Europe, the US, not so much Australia, unfortunately, but also the World Bank and ADB. There's many other players in the region, not just China. But the second thing that the Chinese have done, which Liz also mentioned, with the BRI sort of narrative tailing off, and lots of programs which haven't worked out and lots of promises made which haven't been fulfilled, they've got these new things they talk about: the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. I think I'm like Liz, I can't barely bear to read them. But as sort of ideas, anti-Western, anti-American, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, and whether we like it or not, that gets a lot of traction in the region. Now, I think it is highly contested. I think all manner of countries are stepping up. The US, I think, hides its light under a bushel in some respects. We have this sort of shiny object, the TPP, which the US, initiated, then dropped out of. But if all sorts of countries, like Malaysia, for example, which is, let's say, politely leaning towards China these days, US is still by far the biggest investor in Malaysia. If the US economy grows by 1%, that has a far more transformative impact immediately than TPP does, for example, in terms of pulling in stuff from the region. So I think we're really struggling there, but I don't think it's game over as China would want you to believe.
And what about, Richard, picking up on the Australian dimension specifically, looking at the sort of arc of the last decade from what was seen as a pretty benign strategic setting to now zero warning time, punctured, I guess, in between by things like COVID and economic coercion, decline in trust in China, now attempt to stabilise relations, obviously the visit just taking place this week. How do you see that arc, and is Australia prepared for these sorts of issues that we're discussing today? New instruments, we'll be talking later about the trading system, but we've basically put a lot of store in WTO, traditional free trade agreements that didn't have a lot to say about state-owned enterprises. So how are we as a country...
Australia, China.
US, China.
Sorry.
I'm pretty sure
Australia,
we don't have
yeah,
that.
sorry. Australia, China, FTA.
Yeah.
How are we adjusting, from your perspective, to the new debates that we're having to have in the context of this competition?
Well, I'll start by putting it this way. I was in Japan a few weeks ago and seeing the METI people. Dr. Suzuki says the Japanese are relearning industry policy. They have grand plans for the world, but they've got the muscle memory for these issues that we do not have, and the expertise in the bureaucracy, and frankly, respect for those ideas in the bureaucracy. Whether you think the government's Future Made in Australia is a good idea or not, it was fascinating to watch the way it was denounced with this kind of doctrinal vehemence by many economists, and also, the major papers in Australia, the Financial Review, the Australian, sort of free trade, that's the mother's milk, tariffs, it's protection. And I understand why, of course, because we tried industry policy and it didn't work, and we didn't do it very well. In fact, I dug up a quote from a famous Harvard professor, which was, I think, the trick for the government is not to pick winners, but to know when it has a loser. And we took decades to work that out. So I understand that. I understand the criticism of us making solar panels. If there's a conflict, heaven forbid, in the region, I don't think in terms of sovereign capability you're going to be very worried about whether you can make solar panels or not. But the fact is that most of the Future Made in Australia initiatives are basically related to minerals and our comparative advantage. I'll just say one other thing. The critical minerals, lithium, we have all the resources and the like. The point of industry policy is to subsidise an industry to make it export competitive and freestanding. But in critical minerals, I wonder about that. If, in fact, we are to build up a critical mineral industry, we might have to subsidise it for decades to compete with China, because they can, there's extraordinary dominance of the industry. They have the pricing power and the willingness and the track record of using that to destroy pricing to drive others out of the industry. So if Japan, South Korea, Europe, the US all invest in Australia, it might end up being some kind of utility where you guaranteed 7-8% a year or something, simply to keep those supplies in a secure fashion. So it's not so you subsidise it. The Morrison government started this, as you would know. They had started industry policy, or restarted it with the loan to Iluka Resources. But if you're going to start this industry, you can't just put it on its feet and say, okay, you're on your own now. You might need to give it support for a long, long time. So, of course, we're not prepared very well for any of this, but at least we're talking about it.
And Liz, going back to, I guess, your experience at the leading edge of, I guess, the transformation of Commerce Department, what it's doing, the partnerships between government and business that we've been talking about. Give us your sense of what you saw behind the curtain, what worked and what didn't work in terms of getting business engaged in some of these difficult conversations. We heard this morning about, the question of what competitors are doing, and how did the Commerce Department bring people around an objective, and what other lessons do you think a country like Australia can learn?
So we brought some people from the national security side in, had them brought with CEOs, held roundtables with CEOs where national security people had an opportunity to explain to the business leaders, this is kind of what we're trying to do with regard to China, and business leaders, and I think maybe it was Emily said, we want clarity and consistency, but we are patriotic actors, we're American companies, and we want to be supportive and do the right thing. And I think that helped to break down, I think, some of the barriers in some parts of the administration that were less business-oriented, maybe. I found, and watching a very steady stream of CEOs come through the Secretary's office, that when the Secretary would ask business to step up and help, for example, an early project that we did with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework was on digital skilling. So even before the IPEF launched formally, when we launched it in Los Angeles, we worked to get 14 US companies to support 500,000 digital skilling opportunities for the 7 emerging economies of IPEF. And I can tell you that when the trade minister of Fiji stood up and said, this, because he got 4 companies, Microsoft, Apple, these, to do these digital skilling things in a country of 3 million people, they would never have done this otherwise. Stand and say, this is why IPEF is so great. Right? I think that's really important. And I think across the board, whether we're looking at Quad and other things, business has stepped up in really important ways. And I guess the last way in which the sort of public-private partnership element has worked, especially with commerce, has worked well, is that the Secretary has brought in people with business experience. So the person who's running the CHIPS investment fund is a former partner at KKR, right, which is a big private equity firm in the United States. We have bankers from State Street, from Goldman Sachs, that are the relationship bankers for Samsung and for TSMC and Intel, et cetera. So people that actually know the business. It's not about taking government officials and trying to train them up to do this work. It's about bringing people who have real expertise. And across all of those economic tools that we discussed, like the export controls, and also trying to bring people in with real industry expertise. I think there is a real recognition that it's too easy to swing really wide in some of these things, to overshoot. And what we really need to do is to engage business up front, to understand second and third order impacts, before we take some of the moves that we do.
It's interesting you say that. When I was in Washington last December, the term that kept coming up in meetings was threading the needle.
No.
That you're threading the needle between the commercial interests that you're trying to pursue at the same time as you're protecting national security. And that was right from the design of laws, the IRA and other things, right to the implementation. So it stuck in my head as sort of that's the art, I guess, in this context. In the time available, I think we probably need to hear from you, Liz, about the election. The great
Can I just say?
cliche.
Can I just say that from the minute that President Biden was elected, from almost the minute he took office until today, President Trump has remained a specter. Whenever I've traveled, especially in Europe because they were so traumatized by Trump. Asia managed through it a little bit better, but he's never left. It's always like, well, what if Trump comes back? Well, what if Trump comes back? I'm like, it's 3-4 years away. Like, really? but I guess now it's legitimate
Yeah, well,
question.
I'll just say, and
So painful.
colleagues in the room, there's a lot of interest in Canberra, I have to say, about the outcome of the election. I mean, as an old speechwriter, there's the sort of cliche of after the colon, you always put risks and opportunities, and the other cliche is continuity and change. So if we look at continuity and change, what should we be looking for in terms of continuity in US-China policy, and what should we be looking for in terms of change?
I mean, I think in terms of the change element, President Trump has, talked about, dramatically ratcheting up tariffs, across the board, of course, across the board throughout the whole world, not just on China, but taking a more even tougher stance. He's talked about actual decoupling in some areas, or his representatives talk about actual decoupling in some areas like pharmaceuticals and electronics, like want to be out in 4 years, something like that. I think it's, a little bit early to tell how that would actually materialize in terms of real policy. Obviously, doing something like that, particularly with pharmaceuticals, is basically impossible. It's literally impossible to do that unless he wants to tank every American pharmaceutical company. We could not function without the trade. I think on the fastest sort of de-risking to decoupling that I've heard is 8 years in terms of Chinese API dependence, and so it just couldn't even happen. But the ambition is there, and I think that is significant, right? That's the mentality that he's entering into. Of course, people will point out that you never know, is he gonna offer a deal, like he tried with China. He would mention, oh, if you give us a good trade deal, then we'll, give up on something else for you, Taiwan or something like that. We don't know what he's going to do. But I think that there's very little opportunity, again, whether it's a Trump or a Biden administration, for a fundamentally positive shift in the relationship unless something very significant changes in China first. I don't see anything in the Trump administration that tells me that we're going to see a brand new day in the US-China relationship. We'll have to look at who he surrounds himself with. But I do have a recommendation for Australia. Do you want to hear it?
Go for it.
Okay. So this was actually told to me by a Trump administration official who said, it's not that President Trump loved dictators. It's that he wants partners who are strong leaders, where he feels as though if you make a deal, they can execute the deal. So if you can just make sure that you have a strong leader who can execute a deal, I think you'll be in pretty good shape.
Okay. Well, I did get to work with our former leader, who had a surprisingly good relationship, and
exactly.
one of the few state dinners, and it was, in a sense, coming off a lot of annoying interactions with other world leaders. So I always say that Scott Morrison did very well, based on the timing as much as anything. But look, one final question to both our panellists. It's about China and the closure of China over the last 5-10 years. You've both written extensively about the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping. What does the non-China expert, how do we think about that? How do we think of the closure of China in terms of our understanding of that society, in terms of reacting to, I mean, are we all trying to just read tea leaves now? What are the organs that can actually help us better understand so we can set policies in our own interests?
Yeah, I think it's extremely difficult, and it's going to get more difficult if China continues down this path. For example, we're getting a lot of good academic work done by people in the field 5 years ago. Now there's nobody doing that work, so in 5 or 10 years ago, we might be even blinder than we are now. We'll rely more on intelligence. I have no insight into the quality of that, but that's not all that you want to be looking at. You want to have personal interactions, being able to see people, talk to people, et cetera, that's being diminished. I think the opacity is particularly great at the top. You're meant to infer intentions from capabilities. Well, we know what the capabilities are, we know what the intentions are, but what's the timing? When does it unfold? And the like, and that makes it more difficult to see. I guess the one good thing is that certainly China is, in some respects, trying to build a war economy, to leverage, to reduce the ability of the US and its allies to leverage them in any respect at all. And that applies not just to technology, it applies to food, all sorts of things that they're doing. But that's a struggle for them, actually. You know, they are very much a contingent economy, you know, for energy and for food stuffs and the like. And they can't cut themselves off, I think. Now, maybe they can get more from like-mindeds like Russia and the like. We'll see about that. So in that respect, the persistence of globalization is actually a good thing, because they're much, you know, China wide into the world lifts the cost for them of any action. Liz?
Yeah, I think, you know, if you just read what Xi Jinping says and match it up with what he does, you'll find a very high percentage of correlation, that he is somebody who does what he says he's going to do. And so the sort of Xi Jinping is man of mystery. I don't think that holds so much anymore. And then I would just say, so I just track him and what he does, and I find that I'm pretty good at some form of predictive capabilities. But I do think it's really interesting right at this particular moment to look into Chinese journals, academic journals and foreign policy journals, and see that there really is a lot of debate going on. And I think a couple of years back, I thought, oh, nobody has the opportunity to voice anything publicly anymore. But if you look, there's a lot of dissent around China's support for Russia. There's a lot of dissent around the direction of the Chinese economy, discussions on China, the rule of law. So I think there's a lot of interesting dissent and discontent that's burbling around below the surface if you take the time to look. Whether that has any impact on Xi Jinping or on policy is a different issue, but it's still interesting.
And look, given I've set the timings for these sections, I'm going to break my rules for myself and allow one question before we finish, because it's such a fascinating topic. If there is a question, there's one over on the right. My right.
Elizabeth, just a quick prelude.
Sorry, could you identify?
Patrick Darcy, Commonwealth Treasury. You noted 2008 as a kind of key moment, and I think you're right, but I think there's something you missed, which is actually the panic in the Chinese system is when they really blew up their own internal fiscal system. Zhu Rongji had put a lot of discipline into the system, and from that point on, they haven't had that discipline. So now, 15 years later, they still have a lot of issues in their financial system that are arguably starting to come to a head. So my question is, how does the US and sort of global policy respond if the Chinese system really does falter in a sort of material way? Is that a victory, or is that something that needs to be addressed?
You know, I don't see it as a victory unless that faltering brings them back around to a policy of reform and opening. Then I call it a victory. Otherwise, I don't see it as a victory. It could have some positive implications, possibly in terms of slowing down Chinese investment, you know, into the military. But truth be told, you know, look at what they've done, how little they've done, frankly, to build up their social welfare net, how little they've done to boost consumer demand. It's taking any steps. All they've done is continue to, you know, build up the military, continue to support the Belt and Road Initiative, although quite right, since 2016 it's gone down. But 2023 is back up from 2022, so who knows? So they've got their priorities. So I would say that those would be the things that I would consider to be a victory, right? If they change their policies on economic reform and opening, that would be the victory.
Okay, well, look, that's the end of this session. Could you join with me in thanking Liz and Richard? So just before lunch, we're going to break it up a bit deliberately. We're going to do an audience poll. So one of the themes that's going to run through this whole day and a half, thank you, is around managing risk and ranking risk. What are we seeking to de-risk as societies, as economies, as businesses? So my colleague Jared Monchin, I'll invite up to operationalise this. Having me do anything with technology is a little bit like politicians with children, and this is a bit of an in for the Australians in the audience. My former boss, you might recall, Scott Morrison barrelled a kid in Tasmania during the last election campaign. Well, that's pretty much, if I'm dealing with technology, that's a bit what it looks like. So I'm going to ask Jared to come forward and run through. We'll have 3 questions. They're really designed to elicit some views about potential risks to economic security. One of them is parochial, I'll say that. It's got an Australian dimension, but it's also trying to look at there's state a dimension, a non-state dimension, and there's deep structural forces. So how do we rank the different risks to economic security in this turbulent world? But I'll hand over to Jared.
Thanks, John. And as he said, I'm the Director of Research here at the Australia Center, but a far more important part of my bio is, yes, I was Liz's RA almost, thank you, almost a decade and a half ago, but who's counting? So we are going to be doing this poll. You can see it on your tables as well as the screen. If you scan it, it is a simple question. There will be 3 questions. You should have access now to your first one. I did graduate high school in Chicago, so I hope, though, that is not the same as Chicago with voting early and often. Hopefully you can only do 1 vote. And what we're going to be doing is after this, we'll show you the results of the 3 questions. And then we're going to poll you again tomorrow. We're going to see, given the esteemed group of folks we have in this room, whether we have changed views. So my colleague I believe the question is open. Okay, my colleague now gives me a thumbs up that we can perhaps move on to the question 2. We're still on question 1? Still on question 1, okay. So as we can see with question 1, we have 5 options. You're supposed to rank them. And you can drop and drag as you see fit those 5 options. State conflict, hackers taking down infrastructure, non-traditional security threats, economic slowdown, paralysis, and dysfunction. This is all trying to answer the question, ranking in priority, what is the most important threats to the security in the Indo-Pacific within the next 5 years? Highlight on Indo-Pacific. Do not think, as John said parochially, do not think about your country, think about the Indo-Pacific. And once we have all the answers or submissions complete, my colleague will then give me a thumbs up. We're still waiting a few more seconds. I will say that John and Mike did want to do Pilates for this session, but I talked them down to this polling instead. Hopefully this will get everyone's brains active again. All right, we have question 1 complete. Now we are on to question number 2. Now, this question is, with 1 being the highest, rank the following threats to Australia's economic security within the next 5 years. Highlight on Australia. Similar answers: state conflict, hackers taking down infrastructure, non-traditional threats, economic slowdown, and lastly, paralysis and dysfunction. And let's not forget, once you are done, you have to press submit. You can't just leave it there. And we'll give you just 2 minutes for this. And if you need any help with your questions, I have colleagues in the room who can, or the technology. I think, John, we've run through this a few times, that he doesn't need help this time around, but I think we should be good. My colleague says we need a few more seconds. And I just try to highlight in these answers, I gave you the brief sort of summary of what those 5 options are, but I'd highlight, especially for that first one, state conflict, which is military conflict or the use of gray zone economic and technological coercion by another nation to undermine sovereignty and security. I think, oh, thumbs up on this question. Fantastic. Now we can move to question number 3. All right. This is similarly, you rank, with 1 being the highest, rank priorities for cooperation by like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific in the face of geopolitical tensions and economic security challenges. Now, you'll see slightly different options for you. I hope you're not just doing auto-select every time. Number 1, preserving technological advantage. Number 2, critical infrastructure. 3, supply chain diversification. 4, climate change. And 5, rules. Now that's rules is, I'd hope you read beyond that and see that support for liberal institutions and norms in international and domestic arenas in the face of internal and external challenges. I think one thing that we're hoping from this is, I don't know about you folks, but having attended a few economic security gatherings before and read a little bit on economic security, it's really nice to not be asked to define it. We're trying to give us some actionable insights from today's polling that actually gives us some ideas on some of the hard choices that we have to make. And if there's anything that I've taken away from this morning, it is that we have some hard choices to make, and it's really important to prioritize how we want to take on these challenges. And then once this is done, then we will show you the results of each of the questions. And then after that, thumbs up. All right, so now we are going to show you the results from the questions. So for the first question, we have the top priority is state conflict, and followed by hacking, taking down infrastructure, economic slowdown, non-traditional security threats, and paralysis and dysfunction. Showing my cards here, that was my choice, but I guess not as popular. I think that is telling about, I think, how folks see this, and I also think about how we've actually done these sorts of crisis simulations in terms of economic security and where we actually have to make tough choices in an acute time frame. All right, I think that gives us answer number 1. We'll go to answer for question number 2. All right, economic slowdown number 1. Interesting. Followed by hacking, then state conflict, then paralysis and dysfunction, followed by non-traditional threats. Again, showing my cards, number 4 is my favorite, so now I'm second to the last. One thing that we've done at the USA Center is done a lot of polling, and we found that across the US, China, Australia, US, Japan, Australia, and elsewhere, that there's a lot of clear definition of the problem, a lot of clear definition of the solution, working with allies and partners, but a lot of debate about how we prosecute that solution and what sort of dysfunction or function we need to prioritize. And so the domestic institutional weaknesses and lack of political consensus on economic challenges, that's my personal favorite, but I'll move on to question number 3. Oops, excuse me. All right, so question number 3. Interesting. Number 1, supply chain diversification followed by critical infrastructure, preserving the technological advantage, and lastly, rules and then climate change. I think that is, again, really interesting in terms of, as I was saying before, prosecuting that allied agenda that everyone seems to agree on, how we make the rules for ourselves. Are we going to continue to have carve-outs? Or are we going to really just do the ad hocery that John Kunkel has talked about before? So thank you, everyone. You'll have to, unfortunately, suffer through another one of these tomorrow, but now I'll turn it back to John.